The scent of peonies and betrayal hung heavy in the manicured gardens of the Foster estate. At the center of it all was Madeline, radiant and pregnant, hosting a baby shower that was the envy of the city. But when her husband's mistress, Kendra, crashed the party, flaunting a diamond-studded gift and a secret of her own, the pastel-perfect world was set to explode. Everyone expected tears. They expected a scene. They expected the scorned wife to fall apart. What they didn't expect was that Madeline's smile was a weapon, and she was about to unwrap the only gift that truly mattered, devastating ice-cold revenge. The day of the baby shower dawned with an almost cinematic perfection over the Foster estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Sunlight, thick and golden as honey, poured over acres of impossibly green lawn, making the dew on the white rose bushes glitter like scattered diamonds. From the grand terrace of the main house, Madeline Foster watched the flurry of activity below. Staff in crisp white uniforms arranged tables draped in pale blue and cream linen. A string quartet was tuning their instruments near a fountain sculpted like a Greek myth. It was a scene of serene opulence, meticulously crafted just like every other aspect of her life for the past 5 years. At 29, Madeline was the epitome of the millionaire's wife. Graceful, impeccably dressed, with a smile that could charm senators, and a quiet poise that suggested old money, even though she came from none. She ran the Foster Foundation's charitable board, hosted flawless dinners, and was now at 7 months pregnant, providing the one thing the Foster legacy required an heir. She placed a hand on the gentle swell of her stomach, a protective, almost automatic gesture. Inside her son kicked a tiny, insistent flutter that was both a comfort and a constant reminder of what was at stake. Her husband, Robert Foster, was a man who looked as though he'd been chiseled from the very concept of success. With a jawline that could cut glass and a charismatic grin that had graced the cover of Forbes, he was the public face of Foster Industries, a global logistics empire started by his grandfather. To the world, they were a power couple. He the dynamic tycoon, she his elegant, supportive partner. "It looks perfect, Maddie," a voice said from the doorway. Brenda, Madeline's best friend since their state college days, walked onto the terrace holding 2 glasses of sparkling water with lemon. She handed one to Madeline, her expression a mixture of awe and concern. "You've outdone yourself. It's less a baby shower and more a royal coronation." Madeline managed a small smile. "The Foster way. Subtlety is a foreign language to my mother-in-law. How is the grand dame Genevieve Brenda?" asked, leaning against the balustrade. In her element, Madeline replied, her eyes scanning the preparations. "She's currently inspecting the canapes to ensure the salmon-to-blini ratio is up to her standards. I think she's more nervous about this party than I am about giving birth." Brenda laughed, but it died quickly. She studied her friend's face. Beneath the flawless makeup and the serene expression, she saw the faint, telltale signs of exhaustion, a shadow in her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. And Robert Brenda asked her tone carefully neutral. "Where's the doting father-to-be? I expected him to be hovering, fetching you pillows, and fanning you with a giant palm frond." Madeline's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He had an early call, a last-minute crisis with the Singapore office. He promised he'd be back long before the first guest arrives. It was a lie, a smooth, practiced lie that slid off her tongue with a bitterness she could taste. There was no crisis in Singapore. Robert had come home late last night, long after she'd pretended to be asleep. The scent clinging to his suit wasn't the stale air of a boardroom. It was the cloying sweetness of a perfume she didn't own. La vie est belle. A scent popular with women a decade younger than her. Brenda wasn't fooled. She had been watching the cracks appear in her friend's perfect facade for months. The late nights at the office that became more frequent, the business trips over weekends, the way Robert's phone was now permanently attached to his hand, angled away from Madeline's view. "Maddie, are you okay?" Brenda asked softly, touching her arm. "Really?" Madeline turned to face her friend, the sunlight catching the fire in the 3-carat diamond on her finger. For a second, the mask slipped. The poised millionaire's wife vanished, replaced by the girl Brenda had known in college, the fiercely intelligent, determined scholarship student who had worked 2 jobs to get her degree in art history. A flicker of raw pain crossed her face, so swift and deep, it made Brenda's heart ache. "I'm pregnant, Bea. I'm hosting a party for 200 of our closest friends and business associates. My husband is a respected philanthropist and businessman." Madeline said, her voice a low, brittle whisper. "Of course I'm okay. Everything is perfect." She was a phenomenal actress. She had learned to perform her role flawlessly. But the performance was taking its toll. For the past 6 months, she had been living in a silent, private hell. It started with a misplaced earring in Robert's car, a classic, almost laughable cliché. Then came the credit card statements she wasn't meant to see charges for hotel suites at the Carlisle Jewelry from Tiffany's dinners for 2 at restaurants he'd never taken her to. She had gathered the evidence methodically, her grief and fury channeled into a cold, quiet investigation. She didn't confront him. She didn't cry or throw things. A part of her, the pragmatic part that had clawed its way out of a working-class background, knew that a hysterical scene would accomplish nothing. Robert was a man who despised messy emotions. He would gaslight her, call her crazy, and become more careful. So she waited. She watched. And she planned. Her hand strayed back to her belly. This baby, her son, had changed the equation completely. This was no longer just about a broken heart and a shattered marriage. It was about security. It was about legacy. It was about protecting her child from the fallout of his father's weakness. "He's lucky to have you, Brenda," said her voice, filled with an unspoken understanding. "He'd better not screw this up." Madeline looked out at the sea of white tents and pastel flowers, the perfect stage for the final act of her marriage. "Oh, Brenda," she said, her voice calm and chillingly clear. "He already has. He just doesn't know it yet." A flurry of movement at the main gate caught her eye. The first guests were arriving their luxury cars, gliding silently up the long, winding driveway. Madeline straightened her shoulders, the mask of the serene hostess snapping back into place. "Showtime," she murmured, turning away from the terrace. She walked back into the cool, marble-floored hallway, a woman walking towards her own execution, or perhaps her own liberation. Today was not just a baby shower. It was a reckoning. And Madeline Foster was ready. The gardens filled quickly, transforming into a vibrant tableau of high society. Women in designer floral dresses and men in crisp linen suits mingled under the vast white tents, their laughter tinkling like the fine crystal from which they sipped champagne, or in Madeline's case, elderflower pressé. The air buzzed with polite gossip and the subtle, relentless hum of networking. Deals were being brokered over mini quiches, and alliances were being forged near the towering 3-tiered cake. Madeline moved through the crowd with an ethereal grace, a queen in her court. She wore a bespoke lavender dress that draped elegantly over her baby bump, her hair swept up in a soft chignon. She accepted congratulations, deflected well-meaning but invasive questions about her due date, and smiled until her cheeks ached. Every touch of her arm, every air kiss, felt like a small static shock. These people weren't her friends. They were her husband's world. They were shareholders, board members, competitors, and their judgmental wives. They saw her as Robert's most beautiful acquisition. Robert had arrived just as the first guests were pulling up his timing, as impeccable as his Tom Ford suit. He kissed Madeline on the cheek, his lips cool, his eyes scanning the crowd over her shoulder. "Darling, you look breathtaking," he'd murmured, his voice a low, practiced purr. "Sorry about this morning. The Singapore deal is a beast. As long as the beast is tamed, that's all that matters," she had replied, her voice smooth as silk, giving nothing away. Now he worked the room like the master he was. A hand on this person's back, a shared joke with another. He was in his element, the charismatic center of gravity, around which everyone else orbited. Watching him so confident and oblivious, a cold knot of anger tightened in Madeline's stomach. He was performing, too, playing the part of the proud, expectant father, while living a complete and utter lie. Seated at a wrought iron table in a coveted spot of shade was the true power in the family, Genevieve Foster. Robert's mother was a formidable woman in her late 60s, with steel-grey hair, styled in a severe bob, and eyes the color of a winter sky. She wore a tailored Chanel suit that probably cost more than Madeline's entire college education. When Madeline had first married Robert, Genevieve had been polite but distant, viewing her as an outsider, a pretty accessory with no pedigree. But over the years, something had shifted. Genevieve, a shrewd judge of character, had come to appreciate Madeline's intelligence, her quiet strength, and her dedication to the family's philanthropic work. It was Madeline who had restructured the Foster Foundation, increasing its impact and earning national recognition. Genevieve respected competence above all else, and Madeline had proven herself to be far more than just a pretty face. "Madeline." "My dear Genevieve," said her voice crisp as a starched collar. She patted the seat next to her. "Come sit for a moment. You shouldn't be on your feet all day." "Thank you, Genevieve," Madeline said gratefully, sinking into the cushioned chair. Genevieve's sharp eyes swept over the party, missing nothing. A bit ostentatious for my taste, but Robert insisted. He has his father's flair for the dramatic. All flash, not always enough substance. It was the closest she ever came to criticizing her son in public. She then turned her gaze to Madeline, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "You, however, are all substance. I hope you know that." The unexpected compliment struck a chord deep within Madeline. "That means a great deal to me. The foundation has never been more successful. You have a keen mind, Madeline. Don't ever let my son's enthusiasms make you forget that." The word enthusiasms was loaded, a delicate landmine placed in the conversation. It was a test, a silent acknowledgement that Genevieve saw more than she let on. Madeline met her gaze. In that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between the two women. Genevieve knew her son. She knew his failings, his arrogance, his propensity to be distracted by shiny new things. And she knew that the calm surface of his marriage to Madeline was a deceptive illusion. Before Madeline could respond, a wave of murmurs rippled through a section of the crowd near the garden entrance. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like a sudden drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Brenda materialized at Madeline's side, her face tight with fury. "Don't look," she whispered urgently. "Maddie, please just ignore it. I'll have security handle it." But it was too late. Madeline's eyes followed the collective gaze of the guests, and then she saw her. Standing at the edge of the lawn, framed by an archway of climbing roses, was a woman who was the physical antithesis of Madeline. She was all sharp angles and bold colors, where Madeline was soft curves and pastels. She wore a fire-engine red dress, so tight it looked painted on, clinging to a lean, gym-honed body. Her hair was a cascade of platinum blonde extensions, and her lips were painted the same shade of defiant red as her dress. In her hand, she held a large, ostentatiously wrapped gift box from a high-end baby boutique. It was Kendra. The woman from the Instagram photos Madeline had found on a burner account. The woman whose perfume had haunted her husband's clothes. She hadn't just come to the party. She had made an entrance. She stood there for a long moment, letting the shock and gossip wash over the crowd, a smug, triumphant smirk on her face. She was an invading army of one, and she had just breached the fortress walls. Robert, who had been laughing with a banking executive across the lawn, froze. The color drained from his face, his charismatic smile vanishing as if wiped away. His eyes darted from Kendra to Madeline, a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic in them. Genevieve Foster went rigid, her back ramrod straight. Her lips thinned into a single hard line. Who she said, her voice dangerously low, is that Madeline felt 100 pairs of eyes turn to her, waiting for her reaction. They expected hysterics, a collapse, a scene worthy of their insatiable appetite for drama. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her sparkling water, her hand perfectly steady. She placed the glass back on the table with a soft click. She looked from Kendra's defiant stance to her husband's terrified face, and then to her mother-in-law's simmering rage. The stage was set. The main actress had arrived. Madeline met Brenda's worried gaze and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. No security. Not yet. She rose slowly from her chair, her movements fluid and unhurried. She placed a hand on her belly, not for support, but as a source of strength. "It's all right, Genevieve." Madeline said, her voice a terrifyingly calm island in a sea of chaos. She must be a friend of Robert's. I think it's time I went and welcomed her to our home. Every step Madeline took across the lawn felt amplified, each press of her heel into the soft grass, a drum beat marking the seconds until detonation. The buzzing chatter of the party had died down to a series of strangled whispers. The string quartet, sensing the shift in mood, faltered mid-bar, their music trailing off into an awkward silence. 200 guests were now held captive by the unfolding drama, their eyes darting between the two women on a collision course. Kendra watched Madeline approach, her smirk widening. This was exactly what she wanted, a public stage, an audience, a moment to shatter the perfect facade of the Foster marriage and stake her claim. She saw Madeline not as a person, but as an obstacle, a placeholder she was destined to replace. In her mind, this was a righteous crusade. Robert loved her, not this bland, boring society wife. Robert, meanwhile, was paralyzed. He was trapped between the life he had so carefully constructed and the reckless affair that was about to bring it all crashing down. He started to move towards them, to intercept, to do something. But a sharp, cold glance from his mother, Genevieve, rooted him to the spot. Her eyes said, "You created this mess. You will not make it worse." As Madeline closed the distance she took, in every detail of her rival. The dress was too tight, the makeup too heavy, the jewelry a little too flashy. Kendra was trying to project wealth and power, but it came across as desperate. She was a caricature of a mistress, a cliché brought to life. And beneath the defiant bravado, Madeline could see the flicker of insecurity in her eyes. Kendra needed this public victory because she had no private one. Madeline stopped a few feet from her, close enough to smell the cloying sweetness of la vie est belle. She offered a serene, welcoming smile that seemed to utterly unnerve Kendra. It wasn't the reaction she had prepared for. "Hello, Madeline," said her voice, clear and pleasant, carrying easily in the sudden quiet. "I'm Madeline Foster. I don't believe we've had the pleasure of meeting." Kendra blinked, thrown off balance by the complete lack of hostility. She had rehearsed for a fight, for tears, for screaming. Politeness was a weapon she hadn't anticipated. "Kendra," she said, recovering her voice a little brasher than intended. "Kendra Lowe. And I think you know exactly who I am." "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage," Madeline replied smoothly, her smile never wavering. It was a masterful stroke, immediately painting Kendra as the aggressor, the unhinged intruder. The whispers among the guests started to shift in Madeline's favor. "Oh, cut the crap," Kendra sneered, her composure cracking. "The polite society wife act is old. I'm here because Robert invited me." This was a bold, foolish lie. Madeline saw Robert flinch out of the corner of her eye. The crowd murmured. "Did he?" Madeline's tone was one of mild curiosity, as if discussing the weather. "How strange. He must have forgotten to mention it to me when we were planning the guest list together. But no matter, you're here now. Welcome." She gestured graciously towards the party. "Can I get you something to drink?" This was psychological warfare, and Kendra was woefully outgunned. She was losing control of the narrative. She needed to escalate. "I didn't come for a drink," Kendra said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "I came to give the baby his gift." She thrust the large, gaudily wrapped box forward. It was an aggressive, jarring movement. Several guests gasped. This was a direct challenge, a public declaration of her involvement, not just with Robert, but with the future of the Foster line. Madeline looked at the box, then back at Kendra, her expression unreadable. "That's very thoughtful of you. But really you shouldn't have." "Oh, I had to," Kendra purred, regaining her confidence. She started to unwrap the gift herself, tearing away the paper with a flourish. "I wanted to give our baby something truly special. Something to show him how much he's already loved." The paper came away to reveal a ludicrously extravagant object, a miniature rocking horse not made of wood, but seemingly carved from polished sterling silver. Its eyes were two large sapphires, and its tiny saddle and bridle were encrusted with dozens of small, glittering diamonds. It was tasteless, ostentatious, and wildly inappropriate. It wasn't a gift for a baby. It was a statement of wealth, a piece of branding. "It's a custom piece from a designer in Monaco," Kendra announced, stroking the silver mane. "Robert and I saw his work when we were there last spring." Another calculated blow. A public reference to a trip Robert had claimed was a solo business conference. Madeline could feel the collective intake of breath from the audience. She could feel her husband's world beginning to crumble. Madeline looked at the diamond-studded horse, then back at Kendra's triumphant face. She still didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. Instead, a look of what seemed like genuine pity crossed her features. "It's a lot," Madeline said, her voice soft. "But you've made a mistake. The only mistake was Robert marrying you." Kendra shot back. "No, that's not it." Madeline continued, her calm unwavering. You seem to be under the impression that this gift, your presence here, is some kind of a victory, a checkmate. But you've completely misunderstood the game we're playing. Kendra's smug expression began to falter. This was all wrong. Madeline was supposed to be a puddle of tears on the grass by now. Madeline took a step closer, lowering her voice so that only Kendra and those closest to them could hear clearly. You think you're a player in this? You think you're the queen poised to take the king? She let out a small, almost soundless laugh. My dear, you're not even on the board. You're just a pawn, a very loud, very predictable pawn, and your purpose in this game is now over. Before Kendra could process the insult, Madeline turned to face the hushed crowd. Her serene composure was gone, replaced by something harder, something forged in months of silent pain and meticulous planning. If I could have everyone's attention. Please, she called out, her voice resonating with a newfound authority. It seems we have an unexpected guest and an unexpected announcement. But as it turns out, I have an announcement of my own to share. A gift, you might say. Not just for my son, but for myself. Robert's face was now ashen. He knew with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty that this was not about a mistress or a broken heart. This was about something else entirely. He had underestimated his quiet, graceful wife. He had mistaken her silence for weakness, and he was about to find out just how catastrophically wrong he had been. The garden was so quiet you could hear the gentle splash of the fountain and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Every eye was fixed on Madeline as she stood in the center of the lawn, a pregnant woman in a lavender dress who suddenly commanded the space with the authority of a 5-star general. Kendra stood frozen, the ridiculous silver rocking horse clutched in her hands, her triumphant smirk replaced by a mask of confusion and dawning fear. Robert finally broke from his paralysis, pushing past 2 of his shocked business partners. Madeline, darling, he began, his voice strained, attempting a placating tone. Let's not do this here. This is a private matter. Let's go inside. Madeline turned her head slowly to look at him, and for the first time that day, she let him see the abyss of contempt in her eyes. The look was so cold, so utterly devoid of the love and warmth he had taken for granted, that he physically recoiled. A private matter. She repeated, her voice dangerously soft. You made it a public matter when you financed your mistress's lifestyle with our money. You made it a public matter when you lied to me, to your mother, to everyone in this garden. And she, Madeline gestured dismissively towards Kendra, made it a public matter when she decided to crash our son's baby shower. So no, Robert, we are absolutely going to do this here. Now. She turned her back on him, a final, brutal dismissal. She addressed the crowd again, her voice ringing with clarity. Many of you have offered your congratulations today, and I thank you. But I'm afraid some of you are congratulating the wrong woman. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Kendra's eyes widened. This was her moment. She thought Madeline was about to concede. That's right, Kendra interjected, finding her voice. Tell them, Madeline. Tell them all who Robert really loves. Tell them I'm the one who can make him happy. Madeline ignored her completely, as if she were a buzzing fly. You see, Ms. Lowe here came to make her own announcement, and I wouldn't want to steal her thunder. Please, Kendra, go on. Tell everyone your big news. Baited and validated. Kendra puffed up with pride. She looked directly at Genevieve Foster, a look of pure triumph on her face. "I'm pregnant," she declared, her voice ringing across the lawn. "I'm 12 weeks pregnant. With Robert's baby." If the previous revelation had been a shockwave, this was a nuclear bomb. The garden erupted in a cacophony of gasps and frantic whispers. This was no longer just an affair. It was a succession crisis. 2 women carrying the children of the Foster heir. Robert looked like he was going to be sick. He opened and closed his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked desperately at his mother, who stared back with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. Kendra, high on her dramatic climax, turned to Madeline, expecting to see a finally broken woman. "So you see," she said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "It's over. He's mine now. The future is mine. My child will be a Foster." And then Madeline did the last thing anyone expected her to do. She laughed. It wasn't a hysterical laugh, but a low, rich, genuine sound of amusement. It was the most terrifying sound Robert had ever heard. "Oh, you poor, foolish girl," Madeline said, shaking her head as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "Did you really think it was that simple? Did you think this was all about a man, about who he loves?" She took a step toward Kendra, her gaze sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "You did your research, I'm sure. You know Robert is the CEO of Foster Industries. You know this estate is worth a fortune. You saw the private jets, the yachts, the limitless black card. You saw a winning ticket, and you cashed it in, getting pregnant to secure your prize. It's not like that." Kendra stammered, the narrative violently wrested from her grasp. "Robert and I are in love." Love Madeline's voice was laced with irony. "Let me tell you what you're in. You're in a relationship with a man who lied to his pregnant wife for over a year. A man who let you believe he would leave his entire life for you. A man who right now is looking at you not with love, but with the pure terror of a man who just lost everything. Do you honestly think a man with that little character has any capacity for real love?" She didn't wait for an answer. She turned to Robert. "For 6 months, Robert, I have watched you. I have documented everything. The trips you took with her using company funds, which, by the way, is embezzlement. The apartment you leased for her in the city under a shell corporation. The $500,000 line of credit you opened for her at Cartier. I know everything." Each word was a nail in his coffin. The business associates in the crowd, men who lived and died by reputation and fiscal responsibility, were staring at Robert with new, calculating eyes. He was no longer a charismatic leader. He was a liability, a fool. And while you were busy playing house with your little project— Madeline continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a confidential tone that drew everyone in. "I was busy too. I was meeting with lawyers. I was meeting with forensic accountants." And most importantly, she paused, turning to lock eyes with her mother-in-law. "I was meeting with Genevieve." Genevieve Foster stood up, her posture regal and severe. She gave a single sharp nod, confirming her allegiance. The final piece of Robert's world fell away. He wasn't just losing his wife. He had lost his mother, the true iron hand within the Foster empire. Kendra looked back and forth between the 2 women, a frantic, desperate energy radiating from her. "What are you talking about? What does she have to do with anything?" "Robert runs the company." Madeline smiled, a thin, predatory smile, that she said is the most expensive mistake you will ever make, believing that little fantasy. And with that, She finally revealed her gift. You see, Kendra, you, like so many people, have a fundamental misunderstanding of how the foster family actually works. Madeline began, her voice taking on the quality of a lecturer revealing a profound secret. She started to walk slowly along the edge of the crowd, commanding the full attention of every guest. Robert remained frozen in place, a statue of a man watching his own legacy be dismantled. You see, my husband, she said, gesturing towards Robert without looking at him as the king. The source of all the power and all the wealth. It's an easy mistake to make. He certainly does his best to project that image. The CEO title the magazine covers the bold decision-making. But it's all a performance. A role he was given, not one he earned. She stopped and turned to face the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the powerful men and women who did business with her husband. The founder of this empire was not Robert's father, but his grandfather, William Foster. William was a brilliant but cautious man. He had seen other family dynasties crumble in a single generation due to the recklessness of an unworthy heir. He was determined that his legacy would be protected from foolishness, greed, and moral weakness. Genevieve Foster's face was a mask of stern approval. She knew this speech. She had likely helped craft it. So when William set up the family trust, the entity that holds the controlling shares of Foster Industries, this house, and nearly all the liquid assets, he didn't just hand the keys to his son, and in turn his grandson. He put in safeguards, covenants, specifically a comprehensive morality clause. A low murmur rippled through the guests. Morality clauses were old-fashioned, often unenforceable relics, but in a trust document written by a man like William Foster, it would be ironclad. The clause is very specific. Madeline continued, her voice as sharp and clear as a diamond. It states that the primary beneficiary and acting head of the company must exhibit, and I quote, unimpeachable moral character, fidelity to their spouse, and sound personal judgment. It explicitly states that any act of public scandal, adultery, or financial malfeasance that brings shame upon the Foster name is grounds for immediate and permanent removal from their position as beneficiary. She let the words hang in the air for a moment, letting the full weight of their meaning settle upon her audience. For 5 years I have been a loyal wife. I have upheld my end of the bargain. I have run this household, managed the family's philanthropic endeavors, and protected the Foster name. I am carrying the next legal heir to this family. My husband. She finally turned to look at Robert, her eyes devoid of any emotion, but a cold final judgment has failed on every conceivable count. Robert finally found his voice, a desperate, strangled sound. This is ridiculous, Madeline. You can't. An old family document. It means nothing. Oh, it means everything. A new voice cut in. It was deep, calm, and carried an unshakable weight of legal authority. A man in a conservative grey suit, whom no one had noticed standing quietly near the terrace, stepped forward. It was Mr. Henderson, the senior partner at the law firm that had represented the Foster family for over 80 years. He held a leather-bound portfolio in his hands. Mr. Henderson, Madeline said with a nod. Thank you for coming. Mrs. Foster, he replied respectfully. He then turned his gaze to Robert, and it was utterly unforgiving. Robert, pursuant to Article 7, Section 4 of the William C. Foster family. Trust. Your mother, Genevieve Foster, as the trustee, and your wife, Madeline Foster, as the aggrieved party, have invoked the morality clause. I have the papers right here. He opened the portfolio. As of 9:00 a.m. this morning, the board was notified. You have been removed as CEO and Chairman of Foster Industries, effective immediately. Your access to all company accounts, credit lines, and properties has been suspended. Your shares, which were held in trust for you, have been forfeited. Kendra made a small, choking sound. Her entire body began to tremble. The silver rocking horse slipped from her grasp and fell to the grass with a dull, heavy thud. Forfeited. What does that mean? Robert stammered, his face a mess of disbelief and terror. It means they are no longer yours, Mr. Henderson stated plainly. According to the Trust's succession directives, in the event of a forfeiture of this nature, the controlling interest passes to the next eligible heir. That heir is the legitimate firstborn child. Your son. Madeline placed a hand on her belly. The true gift. It wasn't revenge. It was security. It was power. Until my son comes of age. Madeline announced, her voice ringing with finality. I, as his mother and legal guardian, will be the sole executor of his trust. His shares, his inheritance, will be managed by me, and by Genevieve as the primary trustee. The entire garden was silent, processing the sheer, brutal brilliance of the move. Madeline hadn't just divorced her husband. She hadn't just exposed him. She had, with the full backing of the family's matriarch and its legal fortress, stripped him of everything. His job, his fortune, his name. She had surgically removed him from his own life. So you see, Kendra, Madeline said, her voice now softer, almost pitying. You came here today to claim a prize. But the prize doesn't exist anymore. The man you thought was a millionaire is, as of this morning, a man with a mountain of personal debt and no income. The name you wanted for your child is now his alone to carry, with none of the benefits. You didn't win a king. You tied yourself to a pauper. Kendra stared at Robert, her face a mask of horror and betrayal. She finally saw him for what he was, not a powerful tycoon, but a hollow fraud. The love she had professed so loudly was evaporating before everyone's eyes, replaced by the cold, hard calculus of a bad investment. Madeline looked at the stunned faces of her guests, at her broken husband and his ruined male mistress. She had laid waste to the battlefield. There was nothing left to say. Now, if you'll excuse me, she said, her composure absolute. This has been a rather tiring day. I believe I'll be leaving. Brenda. Mr. Henderson, if you'll join me. She turned without a single backward glance and began to walk toward the house, a woman who had just inherited an empire. Madeline's exit was a study in quiet power. She didn't run. She didn't gloat. She simply walked away, leaving a crater of social and financial ruin in her wake. Brenda flanked her on one side, a fiercely protective shield, while Mr. Henderson walked on the other, the leather portfolio of doom tucked under his arm. The guests parted for them, like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and a healthy dose of fear. They had just witnessed a masterclass in vengeance, and they knew they were in the presence of a new, formidable power. The moment Madeline disappeared into the house, the spell of silence shattered. The garden erupted into a maelstrom of frantic whispers, panicked phone calls, and the hurried exodus of guests who wanted no part of the ensuing fallout. The string quartet began packing their instruments with comical haste. The catering staff started clearing away the untouched canapes and the three-tiered cake, a monument to a future that would never happen. Left in the center of the chaos were the two architects of the disaster, Robert and Kendra. Robert finally broke. The arrogant CEO vanished, replaced by a desperate, pleading boy. He stumbled toward his mother, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Mother, you can't do this," he begged, his voice cracking. "This is my birthright. Everything. It's all I have. Please, Genevieve." Foster looked at her son, and for the first time in his life, he saw no love, no sympathy. Not even anger in her eyes. All he saw was a cold, hard finality like a steel door slamming shut. "Your birthright was conditional, Robert," she said, her voice cutting through his pleas. "It was conditioned on your character, your integrity. You have proven you have neither. You not only betrayed your wife, a woman of far greater substance than you will ever possess, but you endangered this entire company with your recklessness. You brought this creature," she flicked her eyes disdainfully toward Kendra, "to our home. You humiliated the mother of your only legitimate heir. You are not a Foster. You are a disgrace." Each word was a physical blow. Robert staggered back, speechless. "You will vacate this house by tomorrow evening." Genevieve continued, her tone that of a CEO, issuing directives. "Your personal effects will be packed and sent to a storage facility. You will be given a severance, as stipulated by the trust for a disgraced beneficiary, enough to live on, but not enough to continue this pathetic lifestyle. You are no longer welcome here. You are no longer a part of this family's business." She then turned her glacial gaze upon Kendra, who was standing amidst the fleeing guests, looking utterly lost. She was no longer a glamorous homewrecker. She was just a girl in a tight red dress who had made a catastrophic miscalculation. "As for you, Ms. Lowe," Genevieve said, her voice dripping with venom, "I suggest you find a very good lawyer. Though I doubt any lawyer will be able to extract a single dime from my son, seeing as he no longer has any. If you are, in fact, pregnant with his child, you may file for child support. I imagine, based on his new income, you can expect a check for a few $100s a month. Perhaps that will cover the cost of a single diamond on that hideous rocking horse." Kendra's face crumpled. The fantasy she had built for months, a life of luxury, status, and victory, had been publicly and brutally incinerated. She looked at Robert, the man she thought was her ticket to everything, and saw only a weak, broken shell. There was no love in her eyes, only pure, undiluted rage. "You lied to me," she shrieked at him, her voice raw with hysteria. "You told me you were in control. You told me you'd leave her for me. You ruined my life. You ruined my life." Robert shot back, his terror finally boiling over into fury. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't shown up here. You did this." Their ugly public fight was the final pathetic act of the drama. They were two rats trapped in a cage of their own making, now turning on each other. The remaining guests scurried away, wanting no part of the squalor. Genevieve watched them for another moment, her expression one of profound disgust. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back to the house, leaving her son to his fate. He was no longer her concern. Upstairs in the master suite she had once shared with Robert Madeline was directing two of the household staff. "Pack everything of Mr. Foster's," she instructed calmly. "Use the guest wing luggage. I want it all gone by noon tomorrow." Brenda watched her, amazed at her friend's composure. The woman who had been living a lie for 6 months was gone. In her place was a decisive, clear-eyed leader. "Maddie, are you okay?" Brenda asked, finally alone with her. Madeline paused, looking out the window at the scene below. She could see Robert and Kendra still arguing on the lawn, their gestures wild and desperate. She watched them for a moment, not with hatred or satisfaction, but with a strange sense of detachment, as if observing a science experiment. "I'm better than okay," she said, turning away from the window. She placed a hand on her belly. "For the first time in a very long time, I feel free. And more importantly, I feel safe. My son is safe." That had been the core of it all. Not just revenge for a broken heart, but a fierce maternal instinct to protect her child. She knew Robert's recklessness would eventually have squandered the foster fortune. His weakness would have created an unstable, toxic environment for her son. She hadn't just removed a cheating husband. She had removed a threat. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat from the doorway. "Madeleine Genevieve has requested a meeting with us in the library to discuss the transition. The board is ready for your direction." Madeleine nodded. "Of course. I'll be right there." As she walked out of the bedroom, leaving the last vestiges of her old life to be packed away in boxes, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had walked into that party as a victim, a woman about to be publicly humiliated. She was walking out as the head of a dynasty. She had not only survived the storm, she had become the storm. And her true life, the one she would build for herself and her son, was just beginning. A month later, the Foster estate felt like a different world. The oppressive tension that had lingered beneath the surface for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused calm. The house, which had often felt like a gilded cage to Madeleine, now felt like a fortress, her fortress. Robert's presence had been so thoroughly erased, it was as if he were a ghost who had never existed. His portraits were gone. His study was now a nursery in progress, and his extensive wine collection had been donated to a charity auction. Madeleine and Genevieve had formed an unexpected and formidable alliance. The two women, once separated by age and background, were now bound by a shared purpose to protect and grow the Foster legacy for the next generation. They spent their days in the grand wood-paneled library, poring over financial reports and strategy documents with Mr. Henderson and the new interim CEO, a steady hand picked by Genevieve. Madeleine bloomed in this new role. The sharp intellect she had once applied to art history was now directed at corporate governance and philanthropic strategy. The board members who had initially been skeptical were quickly won over by her incisive questions, her clear vision, and her unflappable demeanor. She wasn't Robert's replacement. She was his superior in every way that mattered. She possessed the quiet strength and strategic mind of William Foster himself, a fact that did not escape Genevieve. "You have your grandfather-in-law's eyes, you know," Genevieve remarked one afternoon, looking at Madeleine over the rim of her reading glasses. "Not the color, the perception. You see the whole board, not just the next move." "I had a good teacher," Madeleine replied with a small smile, nodding towards Genevieve. A genuine affection and deep respect had grown between them. They were no longer mother and daughter-in-law, but partners. News of the outside world trickled in. Robert, stripped of his name and fortune, had become a pariah. He had tried to leverage his old contacts, but the story of the baby shower had spread through their social and business circles like wildfire. No one wanted to be associated with a man who had not only been so publicly exposed as a cheat and an embezzler, but had also been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by his wife. He was last seen trying to launch a small, ill-fated consulting firm out of a rented office space in Stamford. Kendra had disappeared from the public eye even more completely. After a few desperate attempts to sell her story to the tabloids, a story no reputable outlet would touch for fear of the Foster lawyers, she had faded into obscurity. A private investigator hired by Madeline to handle the legal loose ends reported that Kendra had moved back to her hometown in Ohio. The pregnancy, it turned out, had been a lie, a final desperate gamble to force Robert's hand. The revelation was almost pitiful, stripping away the last of her power and reducing her to a sad, cautionary tale. Madeline felt a brief flicker of pity for her, then dismissed it. Kendra had chosen her path. One crisp autumn evening, Madeline was in the nearly finished nursery. The room was painted a soft, calming grey, with a mural of a gentle forest scene on one wall. The ostentatious silver rocking horse was gone, of course. In its place was a simple, beautifully crafted wooden one that had been William Foster's as a child, a piece Genevieve had brought down from the attic. Brenda came in carrying a box of baby clothes. The final touches, she said, smiling. "How's the new Queen of the Universe doing?" Madeline laughed, a real unburdened laugh. Hardly a queen, just a very busy, very pregnant CEO in training. "I've never seen you look happier," Maddie Brenda said, her voice soft with emotion. "Even with all this craziness, you look like you can finally breathe." "I can," Madeline admitted, running a hand over the smooth wood of the old rocking horse. "For years I was trying to be someone I wasn't, the perfect wife, the perfect hostess. I was holding my breath, trying not to make a mistake, trying to earn my place here. It was exhausting." She turned to face her friend, her eyes shining with a clear, calm light. "The irony is I finally found my place here, not by being perfect, but by embracing the mess, by fighting back. This house, this company. It's not Robert's legacy that I'm protecting. I'm building one for my son, a legacy of strength, integrity, and the knowledge that his mother would burn the world down to protect him." Her baby kicked a strong and steady rhythm against her hand. It was no longer a flutter of anxiety, but a promise of the future. She had faced the ultimate betrayal and had not only survived but thrived. She had taken the pain and forged it into power. The baby shower had been meant to be her public humiliation, the end of her story. Instead, it had been her coronation. She was Madeline Foster, not by marriage, but by merit. And her reign was just beginning. And so the story of the baby shower became a legend in certain circles, a chilling reminder of what happens when a quiet woman is pushed too far. Madeline proved that the greatest gifts aren't wrapped in shiny paper or studded with diamonds. They are gifts of strength, intelligence, and the courage to reclaim your own life. She transformed a moment of profound betrayal into a declaration of independence, securing not just a fortune, but a future for her child, built on a foundation of integrity. Her story is a powerful testament to the fact that the most underestimated person in the room is often the most dangerous. What did you think of Madeline's ultimate revenge? Was it a calculated masterpiece or a step too far? We all face moments of betrayal, big and small. How we respond defines who we are. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of strength and survival, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable real-life drama. What is the ultimate betrayal? Is it a stolen kiss, a whispered lie, or the cold, calculated act of erasing someone? From your life, for Richard Smith. A man who built an emir of steel and glass betrayal was a tool he wielded with precision. He had it all, a billion-dollar company, a glamorous mistress named Isabella, and a quiet, unassuming wife, Brianna, whom he planned to discard like a forgotten relic. He drafted a new will, leaving every penny, every stock, every last brick of his legacy to his lover. He thought he had sealed his future. But he never imagined that the wife he so casually dismissed was holding the one thing he couldn't control the final key. The penthouse on Park Avenue was less a home and more a museum of Richard Smith's success. It was a cold, cavernous space with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked down on New York City like a judgmental god. Every surface was polished marble or chrome. Every piece of furniture a minimalist statement that cost more than most people's cars. This was Richard's kingdom, and in it Brianna Smith often felt like a ghost. Richard was a titan, the Smith of Smith Ross Enterprises, a global real estate development firm that reshaped skylines. He was a man carved from ambition and arrogance, with a booming voice that commanded boardrooms and a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was handsome in a severe way, with silvering temples that he believed lent him an air of distinction rather than age. His wife, Brianna, was his opposite. Where Richard was loud, she was quiet. Where he was steel, she was watercolor. She had a serene beauty with intelligent, kind eyes and a grace that seemed out of place in the harsh angles of their apartment. She held a master's degree in art history from Columbia, a fact Richard mentioned at cocktail parties as if it were an exotic accessory he'd acquired. He saw her as decorative, intelligent enough to be a presentable hostess, but docile enough not to challenge his authority. He had married her 5 years ago, believing her to be the perfect corporate wife, elegant, well-educated from a respectable, but he assumed modest family. A beautiful blank canvas on which he could paint his legacy. He was wrong. The third person in their silent, fractured marriage was Isabella Rossi. Isabella was everything Brianna was not. She was a fiery, ambitious art gallery owner from Soho, with a mane of dark hair, a wardrobe of daring couture, and an insatiable appetite for the lifestyle Richard provided. She was a mirror perfectly reflecting Richard's own ego and ambition back at him. He didn't just love Isabella, he loved the way she made him feel powerful, desired, and immortal. For the past year, their affair had been an open secret, a wound in their marriage that Richard no longer bothered to hide. He would take Isabella to the galas Brianna was supposed to attend his hand possessively on the small of her back. He bought her a condominium in the very building his company had just completed, a glittering tower on the Hudson. He would leave the dinner table to take her calls, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur that was louder and more insulting to Brianna than a shout. Brianna endured it with a quiet stoicism that Richard mistook for weakness. He saw her continued presence as proof of her dependency. Where would she go? What would she do? She was a Smith now. He believed the name, the comfort, the gilded cage he had built for her was enough to keep her silent and compliant. He had no idea that her silence was not submission, it was observation. One crisp October evening, the dynamic reached a new level of cruelty. Richard was hosting a dinner for potential investors from Singapore. Brianna, as always, had orchestrated the event flawlessly. The catering was exquisite, the floral arrangements were tasteful, and she moved through the room with an effortless grace, ensuring every guest felt welcomed. Richard stood by the fireplace, a glass of Macallan 25 in his hand, holding court. Isabella was there not as a guest, but as Richard's undeclared partner. She wore a crimson dress that clung to her like a second skin, a stark, deliberate contrast to Brianna's elegant but understated navy blue gown. Richard, the new Hudson Yards project is simply visionary, one of the investors, Mr. Lim, was saying. Richard clapped him on the shoulder. We don't build buildings, Way. We build monuments. That's the Smith-Ross difference. Isabella slid her arm through his. He's a genius. I'm constantly telling him he works too hard, but his passion is just intoxicating. She looked directly at Brianna, who was standing nearby, a small, polite smile fixed on her face. The look was a challenge, a declaration of victory. Brianna simply met her gaze, held it for a beat too long, and then turned to offer another guest a canapé. She didn't rise to the bait. She never did. Later that night, after the last guest had departed, the silence in the penthouse was thick with unspoken words. Richard loosened his tie, his mood expansive from the successful evening. Isabella was lounging on the white leather sofa, sipping champagne. Brianna was quietly directing the cleanup crew. You can go, Maria, Brianna said softly to the head of the staff. We'll handle the rest. Once they were alone, Richard turned to Brianna, his expression dismissive. Brianna, you were a bit stiff tonight. You need to learn to relax. Look at Isabella. She's a natural. People are drawn to that kind of energy. Isabella preened, taking a deliberate sip of her champagne. Darling, not everyone can be the life of the party. Brianna is more of the quiet support. Every king needs his loyal subjects, after all. The insult hung in the air, sharp and clear. Brianna carefully placed a stray glass on a tray. I'm glad your evening was a success, Richard. Her composure infuriated him. He wanted a reaction. He wanted tears, a scene, something to justify his growing contempt. Is that all you have to say? We're building an empire, and you're more concerned with the catering. Someone has to be, she replied, her voice even. An empire built on a shoddy foundation will crumble. Richard laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Don't try to be profound, Brianna. It doesn't suit you. My foundation is rock solid. It's made of steel ambition and my own 2 hands. Something you wouldn't understand. He walked over to the bar to pour himself another drink, his back to her. In that moment, watching him, Brianna felt not sadness, but a cold, hardening resolve. He spoke of his 2 hands, but he always conveniently forgot the other name on his company's letterhead, Ross. He never spoke of his original partner, the man who had provided the crucial seed money and the initial invaluable connections. The man Richard had pushed out and erased from the company's official history. Richard thought his foundation was solid, but he had forgotten or chosen to forget the very cornerstone it was built upon. And Brianna knew exactly where that cornerstone was buried. She looked from Richard's arrogant posture to Isabella's smug smile. They saw her as a spectator in her own life. Soon, very soon, they would learn she was anything but. The first tremor in Richard Smith's meticulously constructed world didn't come from his marriage, but from his own body. It started subtly, a persistent fatigue he blamed on overwork, a slight tremor in his hand he dismissed as too much caffeine. But then came the dizzy spells and a crushing headache that even his potent painkillers couldn't touch, a series of private MRIs and consultations with the best neurologists in the city led to a diagnosis that was as swift as it was brutal. Glioblastoma, an aggressive, relentless brain tumor. The prognosis was stark, 12 to 18 months. Maybe 2 years if he responded well to the experimental treatments. The news didn't humble Richard. It enraged him. He saw the illness not as a tragedy, but as an intolerable cosmic insult. The universe had dared to challenge him to put an expiration date on his reign. His ambition, already a roaring fire, became a desperate inferno. He didn't have years to cement his legacy anymore. He had months. His first call wasn't to his wife. It was to his lawyer. Arthur Vance was an old-school attorney from a prestigious firm, Vance & Harrington, LLP. He had handled Richard's affairs for 2 decades, drafting the ironclad prenuptial agreement Brianna had signed without question 5 years ago. His office was a sanctuary of mahogany, leather-bound books and quiet competence. "I need to make some changes to my estate plan, Arthur," Richard said, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion as he sat opposite the lawyer's imposing desk. He didn't mention the diagnosis. To admit to the illness felt like admitting defeat. "Significant changes. I want to draft a new will effective immediately." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Is Brianna aware of this?" "Brianna's awareness is not required," Richard snapped. "This is my fortune, my company, my decision." "Of course, Richard. What changes did you have in mind?" "I want everything," Richard said, leaning forward, his eyes glinting with a feverish intensity. "And I mean everything. My shares in Smith Ross, the portfolio, the properties in the Hamptons and St. Bart's, the art collection, all of it. I want it to go to one person, Isabella Rossi." Arthur Vance went still. He slowly took off his glasses and polished them with a silk handkerchief. He had seen messy divorces, bitter inheritance battles, and corporate takeovers, but this was a new level of cold-blooded. "Richard," he began, his tone measured, "to completely disinherit your wife is a drastic step. The courts will look at this with extreme scrutiny. Brianna could contest it on grounds of undue influence, especially given your relationship with Ms. Rossi. That's what I pay you for, Arthur, to make it incontestable. The prenup protects my assets acquired before the marriage, and everything since has been carefully firewalled in my name. Brianna is entitled to the settlement outlined in the prenup. $10 million. It's more than generous. She won't get a penny more." $10 million is a significant sum," Arthur conceded, "but it's a pittance compared to the value of Smith Ross. We're talking about an estate worth billions. A judge might see this as punitive." "Then find a way," Richard commanded. "I want clauses about her mental state. I want proof of my sound mind when signing. We'll get a psychiatric evaluation for me, the day of the signing. We'll videotape it. I want this thing so armored it would take an act of God to pierce it." While Richard plotted in law offices, Isabella was solidifying her position. She had become his shadow, his confidant, his self-appointed nurse. She learned how to pronounce the names of his medications. She scheduled his appointments with a hushed, reverent efficiency, and she expertly managed his moods. She framed her ambition as devotion. "Oh, Richard, you can't be worrying about work," she would murmur, massaging his temples as he lay on the sofa exhausted from a round of radiation. "You need to rest. Let me handle the calls. It's just, I built it all from nothing." He'd rasp, his voice weaker than he'd ever admit. "I can't let it fall into the wrong hands." "It won't, my love," she'd coo, her voice like honey. "It will be my life's mission to protect your legacy, to make sure the world never forgets the name Richard Smith." She played her part to perfection. She redecorated the penthouse, slowly replacing Brianna's subtle, elegant touches with her own bold, garish taste. She dismissed the household staff Brianna had hired, bringing in her own people. She was isolating him, creating a world where she was the sun, and he was the dying planet caught in her orbit. Meanwhile, Brianna continued to live in the guest wing of the sprawling apartment. Richard had told her during a brief cold conversation that he needed space to deal with some health issues. He didn't tell her it was terminal. He presented it as a temporary condition and his need for isolation as a medical necessity. He was building a wall between them, and Isabella was the chief architect. Brianna saw it all. She saw the new will documents left accidentally on Richard's desk. She saw the way Isabella's eyes lit up when she discussed Smith-Ross board meetings. She felt the shift in the household, the way the new staff looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. One afternoon, she found Isabella in the master bedroom, going through her jewelry box. Not Richard's, but Brianna's. "What are you doing?" Brianna's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. Isabella didn't flinch. She held up a sapphire necklace, a gift from Brianna's parents. "Just tidying. So much of this is dated. Richard wants to build a new vault for my collection. We'll need the space." The implication was clear. "This is my room now. This is my life now." "That is my personal property," Brianna said, stepping forward. Isabella placed the necklace down with a dismissive clink. "For now, Richard is a very generous man, Brianna. But his generosity has its limits. He wants a partner who looks to the future, not one who clings to the past. You should think about your own future, a quiet one somewhere far away from here." That night, Brianna sat in her darkened room, the city lights glittering below. They thought she was a fool. They thought she was weak, passive, and defeated. Richard, in his arrogance and illness-fueled paranoia, was trying to erase her. Isabella, in her greed, was dancing on the grave of their marriage. But Brianna was not planning her retreat. She was planning her strategy. She made a quiet phone call, not to a lawyer, but to her father. "Dad," she said, her voice steady. "It's time. I think Richard is about to make a very big mistake." On the other end of the line, a calm, resolute voice replied, "I've been waiting for your call, sweetheart. The foundation is ready. Let him think he's in control. A man is never more vulnerable than when he's certain of his victory." Richard and Isabella were so focused on the will, on the inheritance, on the money. They were playing checkers. Brianna and her family were playing a much longer and more complex game of chess. And her next move was about to put them in check. With the new will signed, videotaped, and secured in Arthur Vance's vault, Richard Smith felt a surge of triumphant power that momentarily eclipsed the gnawing dread of his diagnosis. He had, in his mind, secured his legacy. He had cut out the dead weight of his marriage and anointed his true successor. Now he needed to make it public. He needed to present Isabella not just as his lover, but as the future matriarch of the Smith dynasty. The idea for a dinner party started as a whisper from Isabella. "Your parents need to see us together, Richard," she had murmured one evening. "They need to understand that I'm the one who will be by your side. For everything." Richard's parents, George and Marion Smith, were old money from Connecticut. They valued tradition, discretion, and appearances above all else. They tolerated Brianna's quiet presence and were quietly appalled by Richard's flagrant affair. But Richard, in his current state, saw their approval as a final stamp of validation on his new life plan. He decided on an intimate gathering. Just his parents, his younger sister Amelia, and her husband Mark. The venue would be the Pinnacle Club, a hyper-exclusive private restaurant on the 80th floor of a skyscraper. His company had built a place where the food was secondary to the breathtaking view and the palpable sense of power. The day of the dinner, Richard approached Brianna in the library where she was reading. He didn't sit. He loomed. "Brianna, I have a family dinner tonight," he announced, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "It's a private matter. I'd appreciate it if you made other plans." "A family dinner?" she asked, her voice neutral as she marked her page. "Am I no longer family, Richard?" "Let's not be dramatic," he scoffed. "It's just complicated. My parents are old-fashioned. I need to handle this delicately. We'll talk later." It was a lie, a flimsy paper wall to hide the truth he was taking Isabella. He just didn't have the courage or the decency to say it to her face. "I see," Brianna said, looking down at her book. "Well, I hope your dinner goes well." Her placid acceptance both relieved and annoyed him. It was yet another confirmation that she was a passive player in his grand drama, a character to be written out of the script with ease. That evening, the Pinnacle Club was at its most impressive. A private room had been reserved with a single long table overlooking the glittering tapestry of Manhattan. Richard arrived first with Isabella on his arm. She was a vision in black silk, wearing a diamond necklace he had just bought her, one that had once been intended for Brianna. George and Marion Smith arrived next. George was a stern, quiet man who looked perpetually disappointed in his son's lack of subtlety. Marion was a woman held together by pearls and social propriety. Their smiles were tight as they greeted Isabella. "Isabella, how nice to see you," Marion said, her eyes flicking over the ostentatious necklace. "It's so wonderful to see you both, too," Isabella gushed, kissing the air near Marion's cheek. "Richard and I are just so thrilled you could make it." She used the word "we" with a practiced ease, slotting herself into the family unit. Amelia and Mark were the last to arrive. Amelia, unlike her parents, had no filter. She gave Richard a look that could curdle milk. "Richard, Isabella." She nodded curtly. "Where's Brianna?" "Brianna wasn't feeling up to it tonight," Richard lied smoothly, gesturing for everyone to sit. "Now let's order some champagne. We have something to celebrate." The dinner was a masterclass in tension. Richard, fueled by a mixture of champagne and bravado, talked animatedly about the future of Smith Ross. He repeatedly directed the conversation to Isabella, praising her business acumen, her artistic eye, her unwavering support during his recent health challenges. "Isabella has been a rock," he declared, raising his glass. "In times of crisis, you learn who is truly there for you, who has the strength and vision to carry things forward. She understands the business. She understands me." George Smith simply stared at his plate. Marion picked at her sea bass. Amelia was texting furiously under the table. "In fact," Richard continued, reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box. "Isabella and I wanted to make our commitment to the future official." He opened the box. Inside was a canary diamond ring, so large it was almost vulgar. Gasps, not all of them happy, filled the silence. Isabella's eyes widened, and she feigned a tearful surprise she had rehearsed for weeks. "Richard, why? This isn't just a ring," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "This is a promise of a future. Our future." He was about to slip the ring onto her finger. The family was frozen in a state of horrified shock. This wasn't just an affair. It was a coup. He was deposing his wife in front of them, and then the door to the private dining room opened. A captain of the restaurant staff stood there, his expression professionally blank. "Mr. Smith, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have some guests who insisted on joining you." Richard frowned, annoyed at the interruption. "I'm not expecting anyone else. There must be a mistake." "I don't believe so, sir," the captain said, stepping aside. Into the room walked Brianna. She was not the subdued, quiet wife they were used to. She wore a simple but exquisitely tailored ivory dress that didn't hide but rather accentuated the gentle, unmistakable swell of her pregnancy. It was a detail so shocking, so unexpected that for a moment no one could breathe. But she was not alone. Flanking her were two people nobody in the Smith family had ever met. On her right was an older Asian man with a quiet but commanding presence, his eyes sharp and intelligent behind stylish glasses. On her left was a woman of extraordinary elegance, her silver hair styled perfectly, her expression serene but unyielding. Richard stared, his mind struggling to process the scene. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. Isabella's perfectly made-up face went pale, the triumphant smile frozen, and then crumbling into disbelief. Amelia was the first to find her voice a choked whisper. "Brianna, you're pregnant?" Brianna placed a gentle hand on her stomach, her gaze fixed on her husband. "I am Amelia. About 5 months now. Richard and I were waiting for the right time to share the news." Her voice was calm, but it carried a clear, ringing note of authority. Richard finally snapped out of his stupor. "What is this, Brianna? Who are these people you were told to stay home?" Brianna's polite smile didn't waver. She gestured to the man beside her. "Richard, I don't believe you've ever been formally introduced to my father, David Chen, or my mother, Annalise." She then turned to Richard's parents. "George Marion, I'd like you to meet my parents." The name Chen hung in the air for a moment, meaningless to the Smiths. But then Brianna looked at Richard, a glint of steel in her eyes he had never seen before, and delivered the final devastating blow. "My mother's maiden name, Richard," she said, her voice dropping ever so slightly, "was Ross." The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was heavier than the crystal chandeliers, deeper than the city sprawling thousands of feet below. The name Ross sunk into the atmosphere like a stone. George Smith, who had been in his son's business periphery for years, was the first to connect the dots. His face already grim turned ashen. "Smith, Ross Enterprises," he breathed, looking from the quiet, powerful man standing beside Brianna to his own son. Richard's face was a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. His mind reeled trying to reconcile the image of his quiet, bookish wife with the bombshell that had just detonated in the middle of his life. Brianna's family was supposed to be insignificant. He had done a cursory background check before proposing he was a businessman after all. He knew her father was an investor, a private man who dealt in international finance. He'd assumed it was minor league old money, quietly managing its own decline. He had never in his wildest, most arrogant dreams imagined this. David Chen, the man Richard had believed was a ghost from his company's past, stepped forward. He didn't look at Richard. He addressed George Smith. "George," he said, his voice calm and even, betraying no hint of the drama unfolding. "It has been a long time. You look well." "David," George managed, standing up slowly. I had no idea." "That was the arrangement," David Chen said simply. He then turned his gaze to Richard, and for the first time Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with his illness. The man's eyes were like polished obsidian, revealing nothing but immense, unshakable power. "My daughter tells me you were celebrating a new future." Isabella, who had been frozen with the ring box, still open on the table, finally found her voice. It was shrill, laced with panic. "Who do you think you are? You can't just barge in here. Richard, do something." Richard looked at her, then back at Brianna and her parents. He was trapped a predator, suddenly finding himself in a cage he hadn't seen being built. "Brianna, what is the meaning of this?" he stammered. "You've been lying to me for 5 years." "Have I?" Brianna responded, her composure unwavering. "I told you my father was a businessman. I told you my mother's family had business interests in New York. You simply filled in the blanks with what you wanted to believe. You saw what you wanted to see Richard, a docile wife with no connections, no power of her own, a convenient accessory." She took a step closer to the table, her eyes sweeping over the horrified faces of the Smith family and landing on the gaudy ring in its velvet box. "You were celebrating your future," she repeated, her voice cutting. "A future built on lies, cruelty, and the delusion that you are a self-made man. You stand in a building financed by my family's capital, running a company started with my father's money. And you have the audacity to try and discard me and your own unborn child for this." Her gaze flicked to Isabella, a look of such profound contempt that Isabella physically recoiled. Annalise Chen, Brianna's mother, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but carried the weight of generations of wealth and influence. "We have been patient, Richard. We respected Brianna's wish to make her marriage work on her own terms. We watched you humiliate her. We watched you flaunt this affair. But trying to steal her child's legacy, that is where our patience ends." The word steal was a slap in the face. Richard's arrogance, his one constant companion, surged back. "Steal everything I have, I built," he roared, slamming his hand on the table, making the remaining glasses jump. "Your father was a silent partner. He put in money, I put in the blood, the sweat, the genius. He's been living off my work for 25 years. David Chen smiled a thin, cold smile that did not reach his eyes. "An interesting interpretation of our history. I recall providing not just the initial 70% of the capital, but also the political connections that secured your first 3 major zoning variances. The Ross name was my wife's, used to keep my family's profile low. I preferred to operate from the shadows. I trusted you to build the company, yes. But I never trusted you to be a good man. That is why I insisted on certain safeguards." "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking. Brianna answered for him. "He's talking about the foundation of your empire, Richard. The one you said was rock solid. It seems you never bothered to read the fine print of the original partnership agreement." Amelia, Richard's sister, finally stood up. She looked at Brianna at her baby bump, and then at her brother with disgust. "A baby, Richard. You were going to disinherit your wife while she was pregnant with your child." She threw her napkin on the table and looked at her husband. "Mark, we're leaving." She walked over to Brianna, touched her arm gently, and whispered, "Call me," before walking out, her husband trailing behind her. Her departure broke the spell. Marion Smith burst into tears. "George, I feel faint. This is a nightmare." George helped his wife to her feet, his face a mask of shame. He gave his son one last look of profound disappointment. "You've created a mess, Richard. A mess I don't think you can clean up." He nodded respectfully to David and Annalise Chen and escorted his weeping wife out of the room. Now it was just them. Richard, a panicked Isabella, and Brianna flanked by the silent, imposing power of her parents. Richard sank into his chair, the full weight of his miscalculation crashing down on him. The pregnancy, her father, Ross. It was all connected. This wasn't a spontaneous act of defiance from Brianna. This was a carefully planned, perfectly executed counterattack. "So this is it," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You came here to humiliate me." "No, Richard," Brianna said, and for the first time he heard a note of genuine sadness in her voice. "You did this to yourself. I came here to introduce you to your child's grandparents, and to remind you who I am before you signed away a future that was never yours to give." She turned, and without another glance at him or the woman he had chosen over her, she walked out of the room, her parents right beside her, leaving Richard and Isabella alone amidst the ruins of their celebration, the shattered glass on the floor, a perfect metaphor for their broken future. The fallout from the dinner party was immediate and catastrophic. The story, albeit in hushed and distorted tones, ripped through New York's elite circles. Richard Smith, the self-made tycoon, was not so self-made after all, and he had tried to publicly replace his pregnant wife, the secret heiress to his company's other half, with his mistress. It was a scandal of epic proportions, a cocktail of greed, infidelity, and breathtaking hubris. Richard, reeling from the public humiliation and the private terror of his new reality, tried to seize control. His first act was one of pure, impotent rage. He had the locks on the penthouse changed formally, barring Brianna from the home she had already mentally left. His second act was to call his lawyer, Arthur Vance. "I want to file for divorce," Richard barked into the phone, pacing his office like a caged animal. "Immediately. And I want to sue her for fraud, for misrepresentation, for something. She lied to me for 5 years." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Richard," Arthur said, his voice heavy with caution. "Based on what you've told me about last night, I believe our legal strategy needs to be re-evaluated. Aggression may not be our wisest course of action. I don't pay you to be wise, Arthur. I pay you to win. That will I drew up, is it still valid?" "The will pertains to your personal estate upon your death," Arthur clarified carefully. "But this changes the entire landscape of the marital assets. If her father is indeed the Ross of Smith Ross, then her claim to the company is not just as your wife, but as an heir to a founding partner. The prenup might not be as ironclad as we thought in this new context." "What do you mean?" Richard snarled. "I mean, Richard, that this is no longer a simple divorce. This is the potential dissolution of a founding partnership. I need to see the original corporate charter and the partnership agreement for Smith Ross immediately." But Richard's rage blinded him to reason. He saw Arthur's caution as weakness. "You're fired, Arthur," he spat. "I need a shark, not a damn librarian." He hung up and immediately hired a new lawyer, a notoriously ruthless litigator named Julian Croft, known for his scorched earth tactics and astronomical fees. Croft was a man who saw the law not as a system of justice, but as a weapon to be wielded. Meanwhile, Brianna was not idle. She moved into a beautiful brownstone in the West Village, owned by her family's holding company, Chen Holdings. The space was warm, filled with books and art, a stark contrast to the sterile emptiness of the Park Avenue penthouse. She was surrounded by a team that moved with quiet, lethal efficiency. Her legal representation was not a single shark, but an entire ocean, the senior partners of Chen Holdings' in-house corporate law division, men and women who knew every comma and clause of the Smith Ross founding documents, because their firm had drafted them 25 years ago. The first shot was fired by Brianna's team. It was not a divorce filing. It was a formal petition for an emergency injunction barring Richard from making any significant financial decisions, sales or acquisitions related to Smith Ross Enterprises without the co-approval of a representative from the Ross interest, citing the original partnership agreement. Julian Croft laughed when he received the papers. "It's a scare tactic," he told Richard. "An overreach. A judge will never grant it. We'll crush them in court." They didn't. In a closed hearing, Brianna's lead counsel, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman named Evelyn Reed, presented the first few pages of the Smith-Ross partnership agreement. She calmly pointed to a section detailing the fiduciary duties of the managing partners to each other. She then presented evidence of Richard's erratic and punitive behavior, namely, the new will completely disinheriting his wife and unborn child, who represented the Ross lineage, arguing. It demonstrated a clear intent to harm the interests of the other founding partner's family. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, granted a temporary injunction. Richard was for the first time in his life no longer the sole king of his castle. He had to have his decisions co-signed by an entity he had tried to destroy. The battle then moved to the discovery phase. Croft, on Richard's behalf, demanded years of financial records from Chen Holdings, hoping to find some hidden leverage, some dirt to fling. Chen Holdings complied, drowning Croft's office in tens of thousands of pages of meticulously organized, utterly mundane financial data. In return, Evelyn Reed made a single simple request. "We require the original signed and notarized copy of the 1999 Smith-Ross Enterprises Founding Partnership Agreement." Croft and Richard searched the company's archives. They found copies drafts, but the original wet ink signed document was missing. After a frantic week, Richard's secretary remembered something. Years ago, Arthur Vance had insisted on holding the original document in his firm's secure vault for safekeeping. A court order later, Arthur Vance, now professionally obligated to comply, delivered a sealed briefcase to the judge's chambers. Both legal teams were present. Julian Croft was confident. "Whatever is in that document, a good lawyer can argue his way around it," he whispered to Richard. "It's just paper." Richard, looking gaunter and more stressed than ever, his illness accelerated by the conflict, nodded weakly. He had to believe Croft was right. The judge broke the seal and opened the file. Inside was a thick, leather-bound document. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. This was the blueprint of the empire, the scroll upon which Richard's entire life was written. He believed he was the sole author. He was about to discover he had misunderstood the very first sentence. Evelyn Reed stood her expression calm. "Your Honor, please direct your attention to Article 4, Section 3B of the agreement." The judge found the page. Croft and Richard leaned forward over their copy. Richard began to read the dense legal text, his eyes scanning the page, his breath catching in his throat. He had read this document before years ago, but he had skimmed over these sections, dismissing them as boilerplate. He had been a young, hungry man, focused only on the clauses about profit-sharing and operational control. He hadn't paid any attention to the section titled Legacy and Succession. He read the words and the floor fell away from his world. It was a clause he had long forgotten, a detail he had dismissed as a strange eccentricity of his quiet, cautious partner, a detail that was about to become the guillotine for his ambitions. It was the final key. The room was silent, save for the rustle of paper. Julian Croft read Article 4, Section 3B, then read it again, his shark-like confidence visibly draining from his face. Richard Smith felt the blood drain from his own, a cold dread creeping into his veins that was far more terrifying than his medical diagnosis. The clause was titled The Unbroken Partnership Clause. It was a complex multi-part provision David Chen, as Mr. Ross, had insisted upon at the company's inception. Richard remembered arguing against it, calling it unnecessary and sentimental. David had been unmovable. It was, he had said, a non-negotiable condition of his investment. Richard, desperate for the capital, had relented, never thinking it would ever apply. Evelyn Reed, Brianna's counsel, read the key passage aloud for the court, her voice clear and precise. "In the event of the death of a founding partner," she began, "full control and voting rights of said partner's shares in Smith Ross Enterprises shall not pass to an heir designated by a will or testament. Instead, said shares shall pass directly and irrevocably to their legal spouse, provided the marriage is intact at the time of death." Croft let out a sharp breath. A spousal succession clause. Clever. But Richard and Brianna are in the process of divorcing. The marriage will not be intact. He looked at Richard with a glimmer of hope. But Evelyn Reed wasn't finished. "Please allow me to continue, Mr. Croft." She cleared her throat and read the next part of the clause. Should the founding partner be unmarried, or in the process of legal separation or divorce at the time of death, or should the surviving spouse be deemed to have acted in a manner that brings public disrepute upon the company or its legacy control of the deceased partner's shares, shall automatically revert to the other founding partner or their designated heir. She paused, letting the words sink in. The trap was intricate, brilliant, and utterly inescapable. "Let me summarize for the court," Reed said, her eyes locking onto Richard. "Under this clause, if Richard dies while married to my client, Brianna, the daughter of the other founding partner, she inherits his entire 50% stake in the company. His will, leaving everything to Miss Rosie, is rendered completely irrelevant, as it pertains to the corporate shares, which constitute 95% of his estate." She took a breath. "Now let's consider the alternative. If Richard proceeds with this divorce, the moment the divorce is finalized, he is unmarried. Upon his death, his shares would then automatically revert to the other founding partner's heir. That heir is also my client, Brianna Chen Smith." A choked sound escaped Richard's throat. It was a perfect checkmate. No matter which way he moved, he lost. If he stayed married, Brianna inherited everything. If he divorced her, Brianna inherited everything. But the true genius of the clause, the final vicious twist of the knife, was in the details. "Furthermore," Evelyn Reed continued, "there is the matter of my client's own inheritance. Brianna is the sole heir to the Ross interest, the other 50% of the company, held by her father, David Chen. However, that inheritance is also governed by this agreement. Let's imagine a scenario where Richard successfully and maliciously contested this clause. Let's imagine he somehow managed to divorce my client and assign his shares to Ms. Rosie before his death." She looked at the judge. "The clause also protects the integrity of the partnership. It contains a morality provision, the very one I cited for the injunction. By publicly attempting to disinherit his pregnant wife and replace her with his mistress, Mr. Smith has already engaged in behavior that brings public disrepute upon the company. A case could be made that he has already voided his own standing as a legacy partner. In that event, a controlling interest could be seized by the Ross family to protect the brand. He thought he was playing for his half. In reality, his behavior has put his entire legacy at risk." Julian Croft was speechless. He looked at the document, at the signatures from 25 years ago. It was all there in black and white. David Chen hadn't just invested money. He had built a fortress around his investment and his family, and Richard had just spent the last year running headfirst into its walls. The final key wasn't just one clause. It was the entire architecture of the company's foundation. It was a legal masterpiece designed to protect the partnership from the one thing David Chen knew: he could never control Richard Smith's character. "The prenup," Richard whispered hoarsely to Croft. "What about the prenup?" Croft shook his head, looking utterly defeated. "The prenup governs personal assets in a divorce. This is about corporate governance and succession. It's a separate legal instrument that supersedes it entirely. The company's charter trumps your marriage contract, Richard. It always has." Richard finally understood. The penthouse, the art, the cash in the bank, that was all he could ever control. It was a fortune, yes, but it was pocket change compared to the colossal value of Smith Ross Enterprises. The company, the empire he thought was his, had never truly belonged to him. It belonged to the partnership, a partnership whose future was now solely in the hands of the woman he had tried to cast aside. He looked across the room at Evelyn Reed, but he saw Brianna's face calm, intelligent, and resolute. He remembered her words at the dinner party. "An empire built on a shoddy foundation will crumble." He had laughed at her. He had thought his foundation was steel. He was wrong. His foundation was paper, and her name was on it. The judge, seeing the utter collapse of Richard's case, looked at his lawyer. "Mr. Croft, given this information, I suggest you and your client have a serious discussion about a settlement. A very, very generous settlement." As they left the chambers, Richard stumbled, and Croft had to grab his arm to steady him. The physical toll of the battle, combined with the progression of his disease, had ravaged him. He looked like a ghost, a pale imitation of the titan he had once been. The fight was over. He had lost everything before he was even gone. The final key had been turned in the lock, and he was on the outside looking in at a legacy that would never be his. The aftermath of the legal revelation was swift and brutal. The knowledge that he had been so utterly outmaneuvered that his life's work was built on a legal framework that had always favored his silent partner shattered what was left of Richard Smith's spirit. The rage and arrogance that had fueled him for months evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, defeated man confronting his own mortality and irrelevance. His shark of a lawyer, Julian Croft, seeing no path to victory and no more billable glory, negotiated a quiet, unceremonious exit. The divorce was granted, but the settlement was a world away from the pittance Richard had intended. On paper, Brianna received a substantial but not obscene sum. The real victory was not in the settlement, but in the corporate charter that remained unchanged. The company was secure. Her child's legacy was secure. The first person to abandon the sinking ship was Isabella Rossi. When it became clear that the billion-dollar inheritance had vanished, so did her devotion. Her cooing words of love and support were replaced by shrill accusations. "You told me it was all yours," she shrieked at him in the penthouse, surrounded by half-packed boxes of designer clothes and jewelry. "You promised me everything I've wasted 2 years of my life on you." "I thought it was," Richard whispered from an armchair, looking frail and old. "I truly thought it was." "Well, you thought wrong," she spat, grabbing a new Hermes bag he had bought her. "I'm not going to be some glorified nurse for a broke, dying man." She left without a backward glance, the canary diamond ring conspicuously absent from her finger, likely already at a private auction house. Her departure was a quiet, pathetic end to the grand passion Richard thought he had found. He was left alone in the cold marble museum. He had built a king with no subjects and no kingdom. His health declined rapidly after that. The stress had accelerated the glioblastoma's merciless march. His parents and sister visited their faces etched with a mixture of pity and lingering anger. He had brought shame upon their family name, and while they would not abandon him in his final days, the warmth and respect were gone forever. Richard spent his last few weeks in a private hospice, the sterile white room, a far cry from the opulent world he had fought so hard to build. In moments of lucidity, he would stare out the window, replaying his life, wondering at what point he had made the fatal error. Was it when he underestimated Brianna? Or was it 25 years ago, when he had skimmed the fine print, so blinded by ambition that he failed to see the quiet wisdom of his partner? He died on a grey Tuesday morning in March, with only a paid nurse for company. His will was executed, leaving his personal assets a few $1 million, the penthouse, and some art, all that the prenup had cordoned off to Isabella. But by the time the lawyers contacted her, she had already moved on, attached to a new European billionaire, and barely acknowledged the news. Most of the money was devoured by legal fees and estate taxes. 6 weeks after Richard's death, Brianna gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him David, after her father, with the middle name Ross. She did not give him the name Smith. Brianna did not attend Richard's funeral. Instead, she spent the day in her warm West Village brownstone, holding her newborn son, looking toward the future. She had no interest in vengeance. Her victory was not in Richard's defeat, but in her own survival and the protection of her child's birthright. With the full transfer of Richard's shares, Brianna Chen Smith, in conjunction with her father, now held 100% of the company. Their first act was a symbolic and powerful one. They called an emergency board meeting. The name on the letterhead was changed. Smith Ross Enterprises ceased to exist. In its place, a new entity was born, the Chen Ross Group. It was a deliberate choice. It honored her mother's family, the silent founders, and her father's enduring legacy. It erased the name of a man who had tried to build an empire on a flawed character. Brianna did not retreat into the shadows. She took an active role as co-chair, proving to be a formidable and insightful leader. Her background in art history gave her a unique perspective on development. She championed projects that integrated beauty community and sustainable design, shifting the company away from Richard's cold, monumental style. She was respected not just for her name, but for her vision. One sunny afternoon, about a year after Richard's death, Brianna was in Central Park with her son. Little David was taking his first wobbly steps on the grass. She watched him, a feeling of profound peace settling over her. She had endured the ultimate betrayal, faced down a titan, and had emerged not just intact, but stronger. She thought of Richard and felt a pang, not of anger, but of pity. He had been so obsessed with his legacy, with carving his name onto the sky. He never understood that a true legacy isn't built in steel and glass. It's built in people, in family, in the integrity you pass down to the next generation. He had sought to control everything, and in the end, controlled nothing. He thought he was writing the final chapter, but he was just a footnote in a story that was always truly hers. Brianna picked up her son, who gurgled happily in her arms, and held him close. The city skyline glittered in the distance, a testament to ambition and power. But for her, the whole world, the entire empire, was right here in her arms. She had held the final key, and she had used it not to lock a door on the past, but to open one to a brighter, better future. Brianna's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about having the wisdom to play the long game. She endured humiliation and betrayal, all while quietly holding the power to change everything. Richard, blinded by his own ego, built his empire on a foundation he didn't even understand, and it cost him everything. This story shows that character, foresight, and integrity are the most valuable assets of all ones that can't be bought, sold, or stolen in a will. What did you think of Brianna's strategy? Was it a masterclass in quiet revenge or a necessary act of self-preservation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever seen a situation where the most overlooked person turned out to be the most powerful? Share your story. And if you love tales of incredible drama and satisfying justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.